Today, we delve into one of the most decisive and dramatic chapters of World War II.
British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government
Der Nationalregierung auf den Gebieten des wirtschaftlichen Lebens.
England is in war with Germany. I tell you, I'm going cold now when I went then.
Наступил великий день победы над Германией. Действительная капитуляция вооруженных сил Германии.
Richtighels, ob du glaubst, dass ich fleißig gewesen bin, dass ich gearbeitet habe, dass ich mich in diesen Jahren für dich eingesetzt habe.
Mayday, we have an emergency. Can you read me? Over.
The Soviet advance towards Berlin, and how Soviet forces found themselves just 450 miles from victory. The year is 1945, and the Third Reich is in its death throes. But while much of the world held its breath, a relentless force from the east was on its way to crush it forever. This is the story of the Red Army's final push, a campaign that would change the map of Europe and the balance of power for decades to come. By early 1945, the Soviet forces were closing in on Berlin, and what had started as a desperate struggle for survival had transformed into an unstoppable force. But how did the Soviets get so close? What strategies propelled them forward, and what challenges did they face as they marched through Europe toward the heart of Nazi Germany? This is the full story of their journey, their tactics, and the war-changing battle that was about to unfold. The Eastern Front, a long, brutal struggle. Let's rewind to 1941, when Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in history. Hitler's forces, caught up in their ambition for Lebensraum, or living space, sought to crush the Soviet Union and decimate communism. The ensuing conflict, known as the Eastern Front, would become the bloodiest theater of the war. The German invasion pushed deep into Soviet territory, reaching as far as the gates of Moscow and Stalingrad. But in Stalingrad, the Soviets delivered a crushing blow to Hitler's forces. That victory, along with the successful counteroffensive at Kursk in 1943, marked the beginning of the Soviet resurgence. By late 1944, after years of horrific battles, Soviet forces had pushed the Germans back, retaking vast amounts of territory in Eastern Europe. With each step forward, the Soviet army gained more ground, and by early 1945, they had made it to the Oder River, a mere 50 miles from Berlin. But the journey was far from easy. The road to victory was paved with immense sacrifices, countless lives lost, and a determination to see the defeat of Nazi Germany, no matter the cost. The Vistula-Oder offensive, the great leap forward. The Soviet march to Berlin was not an abrupt sprint, but the culmination of years of meticulous preparation and significant battles. It began with the Vistula-Oder offensive, launched in January 1945. This major operation saw the Soviet army crossing the Vistula River, and for the first time, the Red Army entered Poland, a major step in their advance toward the Reich. The Germans, now exhausted, were unable to put up much of a fight. Soviet troops surged westward, liberating cities along the way. In February, Soviet forces crossed the Oder River, just 50 miles from Berlin, and the race for the capital began in earnest. But it wasn't just the military strategy that drove the Soviets forward. It was also a deep sense of purpose and retribution. For the Soviet Union, the war was personal. Millions had died under the German occupation, and the scars of the war would remain for generations. But now, as the Red Army approached the heart of the Nazi regime, there was a palpable sense of finality in the air. The Nazis would pay for their brutal occupation of Soviet lands. The Battle of 𝗟𝘂𝘅𝘂𝗏, breaking the German defense. Before they could reach Berlin, the Soviet forces first had to contend with the formidable German defenses at 𝗟𝘂𝘅𝘂𝘁, just outside the city. 𝗟𝘂 was a critical choke point, where the Germans had prepared a layered defense line to slow the Soviet advance. The Germans had fortified the position with entrenched infantry, artillery, and tanks, hoping to create a last line of defense before Berlin. The Soviets launched a relentless assault, throwing everything they had at the German lines. The battle raged for several days, and despite the heavy losses on both sides, the Soviet forces broke through, securing the road to Berlin. The Battle of 𝗟𝘂𝘁𝘂𝗏 was a decisive victory, but it came at a high cost. Over 20,000 Soviet soldiers died and thousands more were wounded. Yet the breakthrough signified that there was nothing left standing between the Red Army and the final goal, Berlin. The Siege of Berlin, Operation Berlin, begins.
The Battle of Berlin is one of the biggest battles of the Second World War.
Stalin made one of the biggest mistakes he ever made.
On April 16, 1945, the Soviet forces launched Operation Berlin, the final assault on the capital of Nazi Germany. The Red Army's offensive was a massive, multi-pronged attack with millions of Soviet soldiers, thousands of tanks, artillery pieces, and aircraft converging on the city from the east, west, and south. Berlin was a fortress, but it was already crippled by months of Allied bombing. German forces inside the city were ragged, outnumbered, and demoralized. Yet they fought with everything they had. The battle for Berlin was brutal, an urban war where the city itself became a weapon. Streets turned into trenches, buildings became bunkers, and snipers ruled the rooftops. Urban warfare was relentless. The Soviets employed their artillery to pound the German positions into submission, while infantry advanced, inch by inch, through the ruins of Berlin. As the battle wore on, Soviet soldiers began raising their flags over key buildings, each one a step closer to total victory. The fall of Berlin, Hitler's last days. As Soviet forces closed in on the heart of Berlin, Adolf Hitler, holed up in his underground bunker, faced the reality of his imminent defeat. On April 30th, with the Soviets encircling his stronghold, Hitler committed suicide alongside his wife, Eva Braun. The Führer's death symbolized the collapse of Nazi Germany, but the fighting continued in Berlin until May 2nd, 1945. On May 2nd, 1945, the last remaining German forces in Berlin surrendered to the Soviets. Berlin had fallen. The Reichstag building, a symbol of Nazi power, was now in Soviet hands, and the iconic image of a Soviet flag flying over the Reichstag signified the end of the Nazi regime. The cost of victory, a changed Europe. Victory came at an unimaginable cost. The battle for Berlin alone resulted in tens of thousands of casualties on both sides. The Soviet Union, already suffering enormous losses, had to sacrifice even more lives to capture the capital. But the victory also marked the beginning of a new era, an era of Soviet dominance in Eastern Europe. With Berlin's fall, the Allies had defeated Nazi Germany, but the war in Europe was far from over. The Yalta Conference had already begun laying the groundwork for post-war Europe, dividing Germany and its capital into occupation zones. The Soviet Union emerged as one of the world's two superpowers.
I cannot conceal from you the concern with which I view the development of events of mutual interest since our fruitful meeting at Yalta. Events in which our common interests were at stake. I frankly cannot understand why the recent events in Romania should not be regarded as not falling within the terms of that agreement.
And the Cold War would soon follow, shaping global politics for decades to come. The Soviets marched to Berlin, just 450 miles from where they began, symbolized not just a military victory, but a profound shift in the global balance of power. The capture of Berlin marked the end of World War II in Europe and set the stage for the Cold War. But beyond the strategic and political implications, it was a testament to the sacrifice and resilience of the Soviet people, who, in their march towards victory, carried the weight of millions of lives lost in their struggle against the Nazis. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into history. Please like, comment, and subscribe to Luxuria Lounge for more stories that shaped our world. Until next time, take care and keep exploring history.
A car bearing one of the greatest military leaders of all time, Marshal of the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin.